Thank you very much for coming. I'm the Director of Pedagogy of the Consultancy, or TCE for short, and I have indeed written quite a few books. And I do like to start with a slide of my various books written by myself or co-authored, because I feel it does kind of show my credentials perhaps as a nerd. I do realize I look like a typical nerd. I don't have a beard. I'm not 25, a long bushy, hipster's beard, and I'm not wearing, sort of jeans and a t-shirt. But I do like technology. But more than that, I like teaching. So my background is teaching and teacher training, and this is my perspective on all of this. Okay, so we're going to be talking about digital literacies, and of course the first question is, what are digital literacies? So if you looked at the program, the answer is actually there. But I'd like to illustrate it through an example. This is always the easiest way to perhaps explain slightly complex concepts. Look familiar? We have all seen this, probably more often than we would like to, right? It's possibly one of the most successful or famous memes of all time. The original of this thing was a poster, a paper poster, which appeared, do you know what year, more or less, it appeared? 1940s, somebody said the 40s. It's actually in the context of the Second World War here in Britain. During the Second World War, the government produced these sort of, what would you call them, motivational or inspirational posters. There are some very famous examples. And this was one that was produced by the British government, but it was never actually made publicly available. It wasn't shown to the general public. So it lay unused in a box in an attic somewhere in the UK for many, many decades, and then it was found in the early 2000s. Somebody found an example of this, and it was displayed in a local bookshop. People started to notice it, T-shirts got produced, coffee mugs got produced, and then something interesting happened. So there was something about the original that people in the early 2000s really enjoyed. It was enjoyed from a slightly ironic perspective, because of course Britain was no longer in the Second World War, but there was something about it that people thought was quite fun. After this first version, if you like, of the original poster, online, you've probably seen many of these, there were lots. These are some of my favorites. When you look at this and you start thinking about what it's saying, it actually has quite a complex message, doesn't it? It's actually a very pithy, short commentary on an entire political and economic system. And so is that, the one next to it. You have to kind of understand what this is, the symbol at the top is, to understand this version of the meme. And the same thing here, you need to understand this language. This is a sort of slightly silly one. I love that. This is my absolute favorite. And the way I understand this one is it's somebody who's busy panicking, and somebody else says, keep calm, and clearly too late. They've also just died. This one is very interesting. Why keep calm and fake a British accent? Why not an American accent? Why not a Canadian accent? Why not a South African accent like mine? I mean, you could just put it on and it would be like really convincing. Why a British accent? This is a real question. Why? Why do you think? Exactly, there we go. So we have this image of the British as being very calm, sort of stiff upper lip in the face of adversity, and they will never let their emotions show, which is of course a complete stereotype and not necessarily true. But you need to understand that to understand this meme. It's got some complex cultural associations and assumptions behind it. So this is a very nice example, I think, of digital literacies, because there are several things that you need to be able to do to both consume or understand these and also to produce them. Let's have a look. What do you need to be able to produce this kind of meme? First of all, digital skills, right? You need to be able to create the meme, physically create it. You need to be able to work with the text and the images, put in your logo, use capital letters, use the same kind of typeface. And then you need to know how to share it with people. Where are you going to put it? How are you going to get it out there? So those are what we might call the digital or the technology skills. But you also need other skills, including these. So some of those are very clever, very creative. The cultural knowledge, for example, in the first two about the political systems, you need to understand those. You need to have historical knowledge, in fact. Social appropriacy, so what are you putting in your meme? You need to be careful that it's not offensive, or in fact, maybe you want it to be offensive. A lot of memes and a lot of remix is often critical of things, and some people will find that offensive depending on what it's saying. And then you need to be able to participate in the internet cultures or subcultures by sharing it, putting it somewhere where it's going to get viewed, and getting people to take notice and hopefully enjoy it. So there's quite a lot of things involved in digital literacies. Digital literacies is not just knowing how to create a Word document. Technical skills are one thing, but there are many other sort of more difficult to define skills involved as well. Okay? Great. All right. So my co-authors, Gavin Dudney and Mark Pegram, and I came up with a kind of a framework for trying to deconstruct a little bit or pick apart what all of these various skills might involve. If you are digitally literate, there are quite a few things that you need to know how to do, not just how to use a Word document. And we came up with this idea of kind of 4 areas or 4 domains or 4 foci. And these are them. And I'm going to talk you very briefly through what some of these sub-skills are per domain. So this is the sort of theory part. The first one is this idea of a focus on information. Of course, information, the age of the internet, it's everywhere. We need to be able to manage it, understand it, decode it, and share it. But perhaps most important is we need to be able to deal with the massive amount of information that we receive online. Information overload is a serious preoccupation and something I'm sure that happens to all of us. So knowing how to filter out all of that avalanche of information online. You may, for example, use your networks online to filter information. Apparently these days, most people keep up with world events through Facebook, through what people share in their Facebook networks. And that has its dangers, apart from its advantages. Information literacy is kind of the basic literacy that has always been part of educational agenda, whatever the topic. And that is the ability to find information, to be able to assess it, to decide how accurate it is, and with the provenance, basically. So to be able to be critical about the information that you find. These days, and of increasing importance, is this idea of data literacy. Data is becoming more and more sort of buzzword in our context as well. So you think about the data that we generate. Many of you might have, for example, a kind of a watch like this or a Fitbit, where you do your 10,000 steps a day, and maybe you input your food and you do a calorie counter, and it gives you all this information about yourself, often very depressing information, as in my case. How do we sort through all of that data, and how do we understand it, and how do we make sense of it? This kind of counting of stuff as it affects our personal lives, health data, whatever it is part of what's called the quantified self movement. I'm sure you've heard of this, the quantified self. But in education, we have huge amounts of data being generated through learning management systems, apps, and so on. And Philip referred to this a little bit in his talk earlier, if you were here. So as a teacher, being able to look at all of this data that your students may be generating in a learning management system and then trying to make sense of it, that's not easy. The interpretation of data, it's a bit like, well, statistics. You've heard the expression lies, damned lies, and statistics. We might say lies, damned lies, and possibly data, depending on what you do with it, or what you decide to do with it. And then this last one up here, the idea of tagging digital artifacts with keywords, for example, your photos, whatever it might be, and linked to that hashtag literacy. So if you're using something like Instagram or Snapchat or Twitter, using hashtags for tagging, which makes information easier to retrieve and find later on. Okay, so that's the first one, information. The second one is this idea of focusing on communication. And of course, communicating these days with online resources is not just words, it's not just text. It's also images and memes and videos and sounds and all of those things. So I won't go through these one by one, but I do want to highlight a couple. The first one is this, hypertext. Hypertext is text that you have online that has hyperlinks. So if you think of something like Wikipedia, that's hypertext. You can click on a link and it'll take you somewhere else. Now, why is hypertext important to us as English language teachers? Your students may be producing hypertext. I mean, they're definitely producing text. They used to do it by hand on paper, but these days they may be producing texts online. Maybe they're doing blog posts, or you have a wiki, or whatever it might be. Or you have a Facebook group, but they're producing text online. If they are including hyperlinks in their work online, they need to understand certain things about hyperlinks. The first thing is that they need to know how to create a hyperlink. Okay, now that's easy. I think we can all create a hyperlink in a document, right? A Word document. But think about, if I have a text of, let's say, 100 words, what if I have 25 hyperlinks in that text? What's the effect on the reader? It actually makes it extremely difficult to read, because when you read hyperlinked text, your eye kind of snags on each of those links, and you find yourself saying, oh, I wonder where that goes. Shall I click? I mean, not that slowly, right? But you are making these very fast decisions, and it slows down reading, and it also affects the retention of the content. You don't remember as much afterwards. So the number of hyperlinks that you include, or your students include in their texts, is important. If you over-hyperlink, you affect the reading experience. You also look like you don't know what you're talking about. If you have to keep referring to external authority for absolutely everything you're saying, it looks like you have no opinion of your own. So the judicious use of hyperlinking is an important digital skill, and particularly pertinent to language students, I would argue. Another one I want to just quickly focus on is this one of code. Now, by code, I mean writing computer code. And this is where everybody freaks, right? It's not an easy thing to do. It's also not a necessary thing to do. There has been a movement within many educational curricula towards teaching children to code. There has been a movement here in the UK, for example, in primary and secondary schools, to teach coding. I'm going to Lithuania in August for work, and I've been looking into their curricula, and they have included what they call ICT lessons in the curriculum, which involves coding. It's considered to help mathematical thinking and logical thinking and so on. Okay, now personally, I think this is the usual jumping on the bandwagon. Let's all start to code. It's all going to be brilliant, right? We're going to solve education. But coding can be useful. I have no computer background. I've never learned to code. But I do now know how to kind of understand a bit of HTML, enough to be able to look at one of my blog posts. Maybe the image that I've put in my blog post is enormous, and it looks awful, and I want a small version, but how do I make it smaller? I know to go into the source code and change the numbers, which are the dimensions of the image. That is not easy to do, and I can resize an image with a very minimal knowledge of coding. I know enough of coding to be able to do what I want to do, basically, which is nothing complicated. I'm not an app developer, and I never want to be. Okay, so code, again, when you see this in educational curricula, I think a pinch of salt with that one. Obviously, multimodal or multimedia literacy is important. Being able to understand image and text and the juxtaposition of the two, because more and more communication takes place multimodally online these days. So these ones are key. All right, as I say, I don't want to stick on all of these. This is an interesting one, the idea of collaboration, because of course, now that we live in a network society, collaboration is so much easier. It's supported by digital technologies, but there are certain things we need to be able to do. One of them is to be very aware of our own personal online identity, if you like. What kind of identity are you presenting to others online? If your username is, hot, sexy chick 52, maybe in a professional context, this is not the kind of image that you want to get, right? Now, of course, you're adults and you laugh and you know not to do that, but do your students. Personal literacy includes your online identity management, being aware of your digital footprint, so what you're leaving behind in the past, and also knowing how to protect your identity from threats. So, for example, protecting your financial information, not giving out personal information, that sort of thing. Participatory literacy, so using online networks to be able to participate in a wider professional culture. In the case of English language teachers, of course, having your own personal learning network, which might be a group of teachers that you communicate with on Twitter or via Facebook or wherever it might be. Network literacy, this is the idea of participation as well, but actually using networks to kind of leverage perhaps common goals. So the idea of global citizenship fits quite nicely into this, using online media and online communication channels to reach a kind of common goal. And you probably know that the PISA tests for 2018 this year are going to include testing, in inverted commas, of global citizenship. So this is a big one in educational agenda everywhere. Intercultural, of course, being able to communicate effectively with people online from other cultures, and in an ethical sort of way. Okay, the last one. Critical literacy, we have a couple of kind of subcategories here. We might talk about material critical literacy. And by that I mean, think about your mobile phone. Where does it come from? What minerals are used in it? How are they sourced? What are the work conditions like for the people who produce your fancy smartphone? What happens to e-waste when you throw away your mobile phone every year? Where is all of that going? So the kind of wider questions here. Critical literacy might also include looking at new trends, for example, artificial intelligence, AI, robotics, which is becoming more and more important and will only grow in our lifetimes. What does that mean for human-machine communications? What is happening with that interface? How does it affect us as social beings, both individually and in our communications with others? You've probably heard recently about this conversation with a bot that was put together by, was it Google? I don't remember. But a telephone call that was, I heard on the news, where somebody rings and interacts with a bot, a kind of a chat bot, spoken language, without realizing that it's not a real person at the other end of the line. These are big questions that are going to affect us all personally in the future, and probably the fairly near future. And the last one is my favorite, remix, this idea of taking an original digital artifact and changing it into something else, mixing up the elements and creating something new. And the meme that I showed you earlier, the Stay Calm meme, is an excellent example of a remix, where you create something new that is creative and fun and often critical. It can be uncomfortable, depending on what you produce. That's enough of the theory. The big question, I think, for us as English language teachers is why? Surely our job is to teach the present perfect and phrasal verbs. What has this got to do with us? So let's start with a couple of fairly well-known people. Clay Shirky is a US-based educational technologist, fairly well-known in the ed tech community, and this is what he says. I'll give you a minute to read that. So I think basically he's saying we've always had what's known as the 3 R's in literacy in primary and secondary school. So the 3 R's being reading, writing, and arithmetic, or maths. And recently I've heard a 4th R added, which is research, which is information literacy. And he's saying, well, now we need more than that. Of course, we still need the 3 R's, but we need more because of these digital tools and because of the effect that they're having on us as individuals and on society. I teach in Spain, in Barcelona. I'm based in Barcelona, and this is from the Spanish national curriculum, translated from the Spanish into the English. So the BOE is the Bulletin of the State from 2006, which is when literacies first appeared in the curriculum. So just have a look. This is very typical of state education. Most educational curricula around the world will have something similar to this somewhere. In Spain, it's called digital competences, but they're essentially referring to the idea of digital literacies. And what's interesting about it is that they're not sticking to just the use of computers, but also this idea of communication and collaboration through computer-generated networks. And you will most likely have something in your country that looks a little bit like this. And it all sounds great on paper. And of course, the usual problem is that for teachers, what does that mean in the classroom? You know, it sounds lovely, we should probably all be doing it, but how? So the operationalizing of digital literacies in the class is where the challenges lie for teachers. Okay, we've got one more here, I think. This is my co-writer, Mark Pegram, from our book on digital literacies. Okay, so he is an English language teacher. He's a professor at the University of Western Australia, in fact, but a trained classroom teacher, and he's arguing that it can make what we do in our classrooms just a little bit more relevant and a little bit more interesting. And then, of course, I had to get my own quote in there. This is what I think. Bringing this really down to the kind of institutional level. And I think what's important here is this idea of alongside. So it's not like we stop teaching the present perfect and those vital phrasal verbs, but that we start to integrate this kind of thing into what we already do. Good communicative language teaching is good communicative language teaching, and it actually lends itself extremely well to integrating digital literacies into what we do. So I gave you an example earlier of a blog entry. Maybe your students, instead of writing an essay on a piece of paper, they're writing a blog entry on a topic. Well, that obviously brings in things like information literacy, they have to research, search literacy, they have to filter the information that they find, hypertext literacy. Perhaps they need to put some photos with their blog post, so they need to source their photos, they need to respect copyright, they need to know how to quote sources. There's all sorts of interesting things happening there, apart from just the use of the language to create their blog posts. Okay, was there something in these sort of reasons for using digital literacies in the language classroom? Is there anything that you came up with that hasn't really been reflected in what we said? If there is, yeah.
Okay, so I think also there is one more thing. I don't know if you're going to mention that later on. It also gives gives us a chance to use authentic texts. That's really important in English classes. So if we're using digital materials, digital resources, it's very easy to come up with everyday texts that we can see around.
Lovely, thank you. It's a very important point, and by texts, presumably not just written texts, but video, audio, and so on and so forth. Thank you. Thank you for that. Any more contributions that we didn't cover? No? Okay. All right. So, this is the framework, again, all put back together again, but there are a couple of points I'd like to make. First of all, there's lots of overlap between all of these. This is a kind of a framework in the loosest sense of the word. It's a series of concepts. A lot of them reflect and overlap with each other. This is just a construct, really, a way of trying to understand what's behind the term ICT competence or digital literacy or whatever term your government is trying to use. These are some of the many things that we need to know how to do. And also, it's not a matter of, I know it, I don't know it. It's obviously a climb, right? For example, in my case, coding, I don't even think I'm a beginner. I'm a kind of pre-beginner when it comes to coding. But that's fine for my purposes. So it's not like everybody has to acquire all of these to 100%. Some of them are particularly important, though. For example, information literacy, search literacy, and some of the network literacies here in collaboration because of the way we live, but some of them are possibly less relevant for your context and for your students. So we can, keep that as a caveat, please. Okay, so as I said before, the big question for teachers is how? What do I do with all the stuff in the language classroom? How do I bring it in a meaningful way, not forgetting that I'm actually there to teach language? Because most of you are school directors and directors of studies and academic directors and so on, I've tried to look at this more from an institutional level, rather from the sort of classroom activities level. The book that Gavin and Mark and I wrote look at specific language activities for teachers. But of course, you also need to be one step up, and from the institutional level, there needs to be some support for your teachers. So I think for institutions, there are three things that we need to keep in mind, each of which very handily begin with T. So the first one is training, then teaching, and then technology, and please notice the order. Training is the most important. Technology is the least important. And I'd like to gloss each of these for you. First of all, training. This to me is absolutely essential if you're going to integrate any kind of technology into your schools or any use of technologies. It has got to be supported by training. That goes from interactive whiteboards to the use of mobile devices in the classroom and everything in between. This idea of integrating digital literacies into pre-service training. Again, if you look at the curricula for a lot of pre-service teacher education programs, it's on paper, but it's often lip service. And trainers themselves are often not confident in how to integrate technologies into what they do, because they weren't trained. So I still see pre-service training programs where technology is kind of the last session on the last day for an hour. I've just recently been invited to give the technology session on an in-service diploma teacher training course, which I find extraordinary in 2018, and that the trainers are not integrating digital technologies into what they're already doing. It's still seen as something separate, and it is certainly not. It's something to be integrated within the curriculum. So I think this idea of digital literacies or competences as something standalone has got to go. It needs to be integrated into what we do as effective communicative language teachers. Of course, we need to replace this transmission idea of pedagogy, but I think that's been around for a while. Collaborative models and so on lend themselves especially well to digital cultures and digital networks. The spaces themselves need to perhaps be reconfigured from this sort of row environment to more flexible learning spaces, because technology can operate much better in those kind of spaces. We need to educate the stakeholders about why we are integrating the technologies that we're integrating into our language lessons. And that might include parents, depending on what you're doing. You probably don't need to explain to parents that you have interactive whiteboards in your school, but you may need to tell parents about why you're getting your students to integrate their mobile devices. You may need to get buy-in from the parents for that, so they don't think it's just about playing games. Philip mentioned this in his talk, the importance of ongoing, continual professional development. Whatever it is that you're training your teachers on, it needs to be ongoing rather than the sort of fly-by training that you often see. So ongoing, sustained over time. And finally, you can help your teachers get the training they need by exploring formal and informal training options. So formal might be a course, a face-to-face course, an online course, workshops, conferences. Informal might be just groups of teachers meeting together on a Friday afternoon and discussing what they're doing in their class, and that's it. Teaching materials. Integrating digital literacies into the syllabi of teaching materials and into the curriculum overall. This is important. Again, not this sort of add-on, the last activity at the end of a unit. Okay, everybody, let's do something with technology. Let's integrate it as a choice throughout whatever we're doing with our materials. Integrating it into course activities, and again, the key word here is integrate. This idea of assessment for digital. Now, let me go back to my example of the blog post. Your aim here is to help your students develop their writing, right? And you've got them to do a blog post for the class blog, and they've had to research things, and they've hyperlinked, and they've put some images and so on. So let's make the assessment reflect the fact that this is a digital medium. We're going to, of course, assess their language use, because they're there to learn language. So we're looking at their writing, their use of vocabulary, structure, whatever it might be, discourse features. But let's also integrate some of the digital elements. So what about their use of hyperlinking? Is it effective? Is it ineffective? What about their use of images? Are these images sourced? Are they copyright? This kind of thing can actually form part of the assessment. But again, it's integrated into an overall language assessment. The whole idea of digital materials versus paper materials, it's not either or. We can, of course, use both. Sometimes paper is effective, sometimes digital is effective, sometimes it doesn't matter. There was an interesting study conducted in Japan using crosswords, so crossword puzzle type things on a mobile phone versus crosswords on paper, control groups, experimental groups and a control group, and the researchers found that there was actually no difference, that the level of vocabulary acquisition and the level of motivation, there was no significant difference, suggesting that it was the task type that was important here, not the medium that the task was developed by. So we need to keep a kind of critical eye. Digital is not always better or more effective necessarily. Again, technology can be used very effectively to link your in-class work with your out-of-class work, particularly when mobile devices are used. Again, that's another sort of 3-hour training course that I could give, but I'll leave it at that. Finally, the whole technology issue. And again, finally, this is the least important part. Well, the most important part in that we need to be critical about it, perhaps. Beware of this idea of the shiny box syndrome. So as soon as you see something new, with technology, it's always sort of presented as the latest, greatest, shiniest, loveliest thing that is going to somehow fix your teaching. It's often it's often presented as a solution, right? So your teaching is a problem, your students aren't learning, but here it is. And it's all shiny and lovely, and it's technology. This invariably doesn't work. And interactive whiteboards are in fact a very interesting case in point. The British government in 1997 with the new Labour government spent millions and millions of pounds on putting IWBs into primary school classrooms. There was not a single shred of evidence that it actually helped learning, not one. I actually met somebody by chance who'd worked on a working group through one of the universities that the government tasked to look into this before they spent all this money. The working group came up with a conclusion that there was no evidence, no research evidence that could explain the spending of all of this money, but the government went ahead anyway, because essentially what is often behind the adoption of new technology is money and politics. So educational technology vendors looking to make the money, and the politicians looking to look, nice next to a new shiny piece of kit. So this is really important. The use of technology takes place within a wider kind of political and economic context. We should never, ever forget that. So related to that is this idea of identifying the educational technology pressure groups who are coming to you with the latest, fanciest piece of kit. Who are they? What are their interests, really? Philip again mentioned this in his talk. This allocating of training budgets. Now, this is interesting. At the consultancy, we do quite a bit of technology consultancy work with schools and with ministries of education and with educational institutions. And we often see that the school has X amount of money and they want to allocate 80% to the technology. And if there's teacher training, which there sometimes isn't, if there's teacher training, it will typically be 20% of the budget. That has got to be the other way round if any integration of technology is to be effective. 80% on the teacher training, 20 on the technology. I think that's an important rule of thumb. Explore options, for example, cheaper options like bring your own device. So rather than expensive kit, students bring in their own mobile devices into class and having them used in an educational way. And then ensuring that the technology is actually subordinate to the learning aim. So it's not that the technology overpowers what you're trying to do, which is to help the students develop their language skills. And finally, I think this is important. Read the research about educational technology and make your decisions based on the evidence. Interactive whiteboards is a very, very salutary example. So much money has been spent on those, and they can be used effectively, don't get me wrong. I've seen IWBs used very effectively by teachers, but the research says that it's not actually making that much difference. So if your school is short on cash, perhaps it should be spent on something else. If you have millions to spend, well then sure, get some IWBs. But if not, find out whether it's going to work or not first. Okay, I'd like to leave you with this thought. I love Diana Laura Lord. She's a lecturer at the University of Education in London. And yes, I think she has a very good point. Positioning of technology as a solution, this very technocentric view towards technology is something to be aware of. I always think, if you hear a distant rumbling sound when technology is being talked about, it's probably bandwagon wheels. And you need to be careful about just jumping on that without looking at what's actually going on in the background. So, although I love technology and I write extensively about technology, I think it's important to keep a kind of critical eye on what's happening and keep these things to the forefront of your mind. I do think digital literacies are important and they can be effectively integrated into the English language classroom. I hope at the very least that I've provided you with some food for thought. I'm here for the rest of the conference. If you'd like to discuss anything, do come and ask me. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.